Hey, Crested Butte, it's great to be back in the Valley. Excited to be here with you on Avalanche Awareness Night, and who's excited for a big powder week ahead?
Hey bro, they're at home watching on their computer.
Yeah, crickets. Okay, well, you have yourselves to blame if it doesn't snow next week. Anyways, the inspiration for my talk was the most recent Avalanche review that came out was talking about uncertainty, and in the era of the pandemic, we've gotten another view of uncertainty in the world. And as Avalanche practitioners and forecasters, it's something that we deal with on a regular basis. So it was really interesting to kind of watch human behavior over the last 6 months or so and how we've kind of dealt with uncertainty during this pandemic. I've got a couple quotes here. Avalanches are powerful, destructive, and ambivalent, and so are viruses. So I just thought I'd kind of take a look at how we've handled, or just some comparisons between the COVID-19 pandemic and working in avalanche terrain. Here's another quote out of the Avalanche review. Embrace uncertainty. Say, I don't know. Uncertain situations will, by definition, lead you to not knowing, and that is okay. When we admit that we don't know, we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable. More importantly, we recognize a starting point from which to gather information. Then eventually, we might be able to say that we do know, whether that be what aspect a persistent weak layer is lingering on, or how fast COVID-19 is spreading at a county, state, and national level. So there's certainly quite a bit of uncertainty, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. I grabbed a couple of my favorite quotes from Twitter that I grabbed here. I'll let you guys kind of throw that one on the big screen for a second. And so as practitioners and forecasters, how do we manage uncertainty in the backcountry? First off, giving yourself a wide margin for error when you're out there. Basically draw that line. I got this from one of my advisors in grad school. He's like, find that line where you feel comfortable and then take an extra step back so that you have room for error. Get more information. That means reading the forecasts and the obs on a regular basis before you go out into the backcountry. And then when you're out there, be curious. Be looking for clues, be looking for signs of instability, digging into the snowpack. Look for ways to prove your hypothesis wrong. If you're going out that day and you have a sense that a slope will be stable, on my way up, I'm looking for signs of instability. I'm looking for something that'll prove my hypothesis wrong. We have this inherent bias, it's called confirmation bias, where we tend to look for evidence that supports our own beliefs. And so if you believe that a slope is stable, you're going to probably be finding evidence that supports that. If you can kind of come with that attitude of I want to prove myself wrong when I'm out there, that will help you kind of find those instabilities when they exist. If you get to the top of the slope and you haven't found anything that proved you wrong, then you still have that light to go skiing. Share your information. Communicate with your group. And more voices is better than one. So if you communicate what you're seeing with your partners, they're communicating back with you, then you've got more information to base your decisions on. And also share your information with us, to the Crested Butte Avalanche Center. Go to our observations page, and collectively as a community, we have so much more power to understand what's going on with our snowpack if everyone's sharing what they're seeing versus if it's just a couple people and a couple forecasters. And then obviously apply your risk reduction techniques to account for those mistakes that inevitably do happen with uncertainty. Carry the right gear, follow travel protocols, traveling one at a time through avalanche terrain, minimizing your exposure on up routes, and always practice your rescue techniques. So early on, as the pandemic evolved, you probably noticed that the CDC and the scientists kind of their position or their understanding of the virus evolved as well. And that's pretty common with science, is that we're always seeking new data and we're always looking for ways to understand the problem even better. And that's something that our forecast team does as well. So we're out there. Some days we have more uncertainty than others, and we're out there getting as much data as we can to help inform our decisions. This is an example. If you recall back in March, there was when the coronavirus was first coming out, there was a big push for watching surfaces, and it was called fomites, spreading through contact with surfaces. And as they got more and more data, their understanding of the problem evolved into more of a aerosol, respiratory particles, and they changed their stance. And even as recently as a couple days ago, the CDC is revising their quarantine recommendations. And so it's clear that like our understanding of uncertain things evolves through time. And that's something that our forecast team does as well when we're out in the field. We're trying to target uncertainties and figure out, gain confidence on the problems and on the danger ratings. As you probably know, around our snowpack right now, it's pretty weak out there. We haven't had snow in a while, and with high pressure, we've got some very weak surfaces. This photo here is a surface hoar layer that's developing right now at lower elevations, and then pretty much everywhere you go, you've got weak facets developing in the snowpack. So these are two problematic weak layers that we're going to be talking about for quite a bit of time this winter, I imagine, if we get some snow. And so I'm going to just show you a video of what our forecast office looks like when we get a big storm on weak layers like this.
Turn on the lights! Turn on the lights! Nobody move. Nobody move. Where are you, precious? Doing? Everyone just remain seated. I think he left. Do we? Everybody panic! Oh my God, there's a bear loose in the Coliseum! There will be no refund! Your refund will be escaping this death trap with your life! Now a small child use it as a shield! They love and tender me!
So maybe that's a little exaggerated. That might be a little exaggerated, but the big picture is that during a dramatic weather event, we oftentimes have more uncertainty, and then as we get out after high pressure and we have a chance to look at avalanche activity and dig into the snow and get more observations from our public, then we're able to narrow down on uncertainties and help define the terrain that's safer, help define better travel management techniques. So this image on the right is a period of, this is when I was working up in the Flathead, period of a couple weeks where we had an active persistent weak layer, and we were just tracking where we were seeing avalanches, getting collapses, or unstable pit results, and you can see we were able to narrow down the problematic slopes pretty well with just a couple, probably 20 observations there. So as you can tell, the more observations we get, the better we're able to kind of narrow down our uncertainty. And this is just a typical field day out for me, trying to figure out that data. Play that video. All right, never mind. Okay, moving along. So during the early stage of the pandemic, there was a high amount of uncertainty, if you recall. Relatively low probability, meaning that, I know Crested Butte was kind of a hot spot, but if you looked around the country, there was a lot of areas where there weren't cases yet. But it was high consequence and high vulnerability, meaning we weren't prepared from a medical standpoint. We didn't have the medical supplies, the ICU units, or the know-how to treat the disease, and all the sort of medical supplies that we need. So in that case, the response from the government was to stay at home, to basically allow us time to gain more certainty on this disease and to build up our, to lower the consequence essentially by producing more PPE for the medical supply and to produce the wherewithals to handle the situation. So what does that kind of look like as far as avalanche problems when you have high uncertainty, low probability, and high consequence? That's pretty similar to a deep slab problem. And like the stay-at-home order, oftentimes our deep slab problem, we offer, our advice is just terrain avoidance, avoiding the terrain where those problems can be found because it's such a hard problem to manage. So going back to those high consequence, low probability, or just any kind of avalanche problem that's a low likelihood scenario, those are oftentimes, we call those wicked learning environments. So imagine you're a tennis player, learning how to play tennis for the first time, and someone throws you a tennis ball, hits you a tennis ball, and you swing at it, and you can see you hit the ball, and you can see where it landed on the other side of the court. That's called a kind learning environment. You get direct feedback of how your hit is performing on the court. Now, if you were to do the same thing, but you were blindfolded, and someone hits a ball at you and you swing, and you can't tell whether you're even hitting the ball or if you're hitting it onto the right spot on the court, that's a wicked environment. And that's the type of environment that Avalanches are in. And they don't give us good feedback. We get rare feedback. It's infrequent. It's oftentimes delayed or inaccurate. The patterns aren't always obvious or repeating. So it's a challenging environment to be in. And similar to the COVID, over the last 6 months, you've probably seen a whole spread of different reactions of how people behaved with this going on. How many people, at some point probably thought to themselves, like, well, I haven't caught it yet, so I'm probably doing everything right. The question is, were you doing things right, or did you just get lucky? And that's the same thing that happens in an avalanche world, is that when we go out there, sometimes we might have skied a slope and just gotten away with it, and we were this close to triggering an avalanche and we never even knew. And how do we know that? It's pretty difficult. This photo here that I have is from a persistent slab avalanche triggered last spring up in the Flathead. The group had been up there the day or two before, had skied that terrain, no signs of instability. It had snowed a little bit more. They went back up there. They were planning on skiing the same area again. They happened to remotely trigger this slide from the ridgetop. This is one of those rare instances where they actually did get direct feedback, but had they skied that day and skied off, they probably would have never known how close they were to triggering such a big avalanche. So it's up to us to try and get feedback from, when we're out in the backcountry, try and get feedback in whatever ways we can. And so I've outlined a couple ways that you can do that. One is debriefing with your partners at the end of the day. Talk to each other. How did we manage the risk? Were there any points in the day that you were nervous, or that we kind of were drawing the line a little bit too close? Also follow along with the forecasts and observations again, because you might have gone out that day and you skied a northeast aspect and you didn't see anything and you felt like you'd made the right call. And you get home and you look at the observations and there are two different parties that triggered large avalanches on a northeast aspect. And that might, kill your attention that, well, maybe we weren't making great decisions that day and maybe we just got away with it. So always, follow along with the forecast and the observations, and then seek or offer mentorship. If you're somebody who's been in the community for a while and has experience in the backcountry, look to mentor younger folks, or vice versa. If you're new to the backcountry scene, look to gain wisdom from other people who've been out in the backcountry for a while. As we moved on later stages in the pandemic, our uncertainty decreased. We did see a higher probability as the virus spread across more and more states and counties. And then, relatively speaking, it was lower consequence as the medical world kind of learned ways to treat the disease, and we kind of got a better handle on how to handle it. But, so then we started to reopen business and reopen for businesses, and they were applying their protocols to follow along with what seemed like more of a manageable problem. But if you look at our mortality graph, you can see that in the last few weeks, that mortality rate is climbing, and I'm sure there's a lot of factors that go into that, but the one that I wanted to kind of point out that I also noticed with avalanche or with backcountry behavior is something we call message fatigue. Message fatigue is where you kind of get sick of hearing the same thing over and over and you start to let your guard down. This photo here on the right is like when every time I open my phone and look at the news stories, there's always an article about COVID now, and it's been going on for 6 months. So again, how many people at some point have been just like, let their guard down a little bit because they're kind of sick of hearing about it? We're all human, and we all kind of at some point want to let our guard down. The same thing applies, with avalanche forecasts, I'm sure.
Persistent slabs.
Persistent slab problem here.
But now we're going to start talking about persistent slabs.
This is the type of avalanche, persistent slab avalanche, we are facing in the backcountry right now.
Persistent slab avalanche problem. So we've had a lot of persistent slab avalanche issues.
So just brace yourself, because we're in Colorado and we are going to talk about persistent slabs this winter. And that's just the reality of living in a Colorado snowpack. And so knowing that you might let your guard down by the end of the season, and just be aware of that. And I've seen that oftentimes we see more, I'd say professionals get in more close calls later in the season because they kind of get I think it's that combination of message fatigue and just kind of letting their guard down as the season goes on. So, so just to kind of wrap things up, why are persistent and deep persistent slab avalanches so challenging? One is they have a lot of uncertainty. We have trouble identifying them in the field, the problematic slopes, defining when they're going to become reactive or unreactive. They don't give us great feedback on a daily basis. And then, of course, we also all get impatient and tired of hearing the same message. We will hear about persistent slabs for quite a bit of this winter. And, you know, it's up to us to be diligent and disciplined in managing that problem. Thanks for listening along, and enjoy the rest of the show tonight.